Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Have you ever wondered why understory trees, such as box and yew and holly, are so much tougher, harder to break than canopy trees like oak or beech or ash, despite the fact that, first of all, they carry less weight, and secondly, they're subject to less shear forces from the wind. Despite that, they've got incredibly tough roots, incredibly tough branches. That's why you make longbows out of them. That's why the Welsh carve love spoons out of holly, because it's such dense, fine-grained wood. Why? Why have they evolved to be so tough when they seem to be subject to less force? Have you ever wondered why trees are able to coppice or pollard? In other words, to re-sprout from whatever point they're broken or cut. Why have they acquired these characteristics? And I believe there's a single answer to all of these phenomena. Elephants. It sounds ridiculous, but that's because we've forgotten that ours is an elephant-adapted ecosystem. During the last interglacial period, our ecosystem was dominated by the straight-tusked elephant. It was a temperate forest elephant, and it browsed, it ate trees and shrubs and stuff. And it doubtless had a similar sort of impact to the impact that elephants have, say, in Africa or in Asia. And yet, somehow, that's completely passed us by in this country. Our trees have exactly the same adaptations. They do precisely the same things as the trees do in Africa, and yet we haven't made the link. They were driven out of northern Europe by the ice about 115,000 years ago. So were rhinos, so were hippos. Lions and hyenas stayed on longer. We had a megafauna. In fact, when Trafalgar Square, just around the corner, was excavated to build Nelson's Column and the National Gallery and the other things which were built there, the gravels were found to be stuffed with bones. Elephant bones, rhino bones, hippopotamus bones, Hippopotamus amphibius, the same species that lives in Africa today. And yet, all this has somehow been pushed out of our consciousness. Because we don't see it, and we're not shown it on a daily basis by the presence of these beasts, we've forgotten that our ecosystems have been shaped by them. Our forgetting of the fact that we had a megafauna, of the fact that most of the world had a megafauna until human beings turned up, but then it disappeared and we began to forget. And this forgetting has got a name. Shifting baseline syndrome, coined by the fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly. And what it means is that every generation conceives the situation in its own youth as being the state of normality, and that it thinks of the ecosystem that it was brought up with as being the desirable ecosystem to which we have to get back because that is the untouched and pure and normal state of the ecosystem. Unaware, perhaps, that the ecosystem with which we were brought up is a highly depleted one. And then the ecosystem gets depleted further, and the next generation comes along and sees that further depleted ecosystem as being the state of normality. Shifting baseline syndrome has begun to be challenged by what I believe is one of the most exciting scientific developments of the past half-century. And this is the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. Now, a trophic cascade is an ecological process which tumbles down from the top of the food chain right down to the bottom. Until relatively recently, biologists believed that most, or almost all ecosystems were driven from the bottom up. That the type of soil you have and the type of climate you have determine the kind of vegetation you have, which in turn determines the kind of herbivores you get, which in turn determines the number and the type of carnivores which you might get. What trophic cascades suggest is that in some ecosystems, the process is exactly the opposite. To give you a classic example, the reintroduction of wolves into the Yellowstone National Park. Wolves were extirpated from the park in 1926. They were brought back, just a couple of packs, just a small number, in 1995. And within 10 years, they had transformed the ecosystem of that huge area of land. They created a landscape in which deer would not go into certain places, particularly the river valleys where they were quite easily trapped and caught by the wolves. And as the deer retreated, those places sprang back into life. Within 6 years, the height of the trees along the rivers that were studied quintupled. And when that happened, the number of songbirds in the trees greatly increased. The number of beavers in the rivers greatly increased because they also eat the trees. And as they, which are also what are called keystone species, that's a species which has an impact greater than its numbers alone would suggest, an ecosystem engineer, a bit like the wolf, they created habitats within the rivers, habitats for otters, for amphibians, for muskrats, for ducks, for fish, all of which began to proliferate as the beavers re-engineered the rivers, creating pools where their dams were, and then riffly sections downstream of their dams. All of these created this habitat diversity, which was important to boost the diversity and biomass of the creatures living there. The wolves killed coyotes, which meant that there were more rodents around, which meant that there were more hawks and more stoats and weasels and other creatures like that. The bears started eating the leftovers from wolf kills, and their numbers rose, and they then started killing more deer calves, and so they reinforced the impact of the wolves. But check this. The course of the rivers changed, not just because of the beavers, directly because of the wolves. The rivers stopped meandering. And the reason for that was because as the trees got a hold once more, their banks, their roots stabilized the banks of the rivers and meant that they were far less labile than they were before. The composition of the soil began to change because as the deer moved out of some areas and into others, their recycling of nutrients through dung changed the amount of minerals going into the soils and therefore began to change the vegetation. Throw in a couple more examples. Arctic foxes were introduced by Russian fur trappers to some of the Aleutian Islands, but not to others. Where they were introduced, there is scrubby tundra covering the islands. Where there are no Arctic foxes, there's steppe grassland. The reason for that is that where there are Arctic foxes, there's just 1/3 of the phosphate in the soil as on the islands where there are none. For a simple reason, the foxes eat seabirds which bring guano to the islands. They have completely transformed the ecology of the places where they live, right down to the soil microbe level. The Japanese government often claims that it has to hunt the whales of the Southern Oceans, among its many other crap excuses, because if it doesn't do so, then the krill and the fish will be overexploited by the whales and there won't be enough to go around for human beings. And it seems intuitive. It seems to make sense. Yes, of course, that's bound to be the case. You know, fewer whales, there's bound to be more krill and fish because the whales eat vast quantities of krill and fish. What happens? Well, the population of whales crashes, and so does the population of krill and fish. How could this possibly be? Well, it turns out that the whales also are driving a trophic cascade. They often feed at depth, and then they come to the surface and produce what biologists politely call vast fecal plumes. Enormous quantities of poo, poonamis. And this stuff is very iron-rich, and iron is a limiting nutrient in the Southern Oceans. So when they inject iron back up into the surface, into the photic zone, the place where there's enough light for photosynthesis, that then stimulates the great growth of phytoplankton, of plant plankton, which in turn stimulates the zooplankton, which in turn feeds the fish and the krill. And it's not just that. Simply by moving up and down through the water column, the whales keep kicking the phytoplankton back up into the photic zone and allowing it to reproduce more than it would otherwise, because otherwise it just sinks away gradually into the abyss and is then lost from the ecosystem. So you get more phytoplankton, and eventually, when it's been through several cycles, kicked up by the whales back into the photic zone, it then falls away forever, as I say, into the abyss, and it takes the carbon with it. And one study suggests that sperm whales in the Southern Oceans alone, despite their very depleted current population, sequester a net 200,000 tons of carbon every year just by stimulating the growth of phytoplankton. If you extrapolate that to what all the whales must once have been doing in all the oceans around the world when their populations were at historical levels, they must have been sequestering tens of millions of tons of carbon, a small but significant fraction of the carbon dioxide which would otherwise go into the atmosphere. So we're seeing how animals can change not only their ecosystem, but also the physical characteristics of the planet. And when those great animals disappear, what you are left with is not just part of an ecosystem which is the ecosystem with a few animals missing. It's something completely different. It's basically the burnt-out shell of an ecosystem. There's almost nothing of its dynamic interactions, of its amazing trophic relationships left. We live in a shadowland, a dim and flattened relic of what there once was and of what there could be again. Because this is actually an optimistic talk I'm giving, in that rewilding, the mass restoration of ecosystems, gives us the opportunity to restore not just much of the magnificent wildlife that we've lost on Earth, but also, I believe, much of the wonder and delight and joy and excitement, enchantment that we, I believe, have lost from our own lives. For instance, in the United States, already we've seen roughly 2/3 of the land which was deforested, most of the eastern part of the United States, being reforested as a result of the cessation of agriculture and logging in those places. What it is that with globalization, places in which farming and forestry are less competitive are basically left alone. That it concentrates in some parts of the planet and releases other parts of the planet. Now, there's a downside to that, but there's an upside which we should be taking advantage of. In Europe, according to one estimate, between 2000 and 2030, an area of 30 million hectares of land will be vacated by farmers, mostly the uplands of Europe, the less fertile land, for the same reason. That's an area the size of Poland. Now, already we are seeing wolves, bears, lynx, moose, bison, wolverines, boar, beavers, many other species spreading back across Europe at a great rate. But if it's true that we're looking at an area the size of Poland potentially becoming available without any policy change, even without any change in the common agricultural policy, and changes could greatly accelerate the potential for rewilding, then perhaps just envisaging wider ecosystems containing wolves, bear, lynxes, moose, bison, and the rest is a little unambitious. Perhaps we should be considering the return of some of Europe's megafauna. Why not? They still live in Africa, similar species, or the same species. We've lost a straight-tusked elephant, but maybe the Asian elephant would be a proxy. We'd have to find out. It's a possibility. Perhaps the black rhino would be a proxy for the browsing rhinoceri, the mercs and the narrow-nosed rhino, which were here in Trafalgar Square. The hippo is the same species, the lion is the same species, the hyena is the same species. Why shouldn't we have a Serengeti or two on our doorsteps? And at sea, it's even easier. At sea, it's simply about ceasing to fish in certain areas and allowing the ecosystem to recover, what this government had promised, but now, unfortunately, it's reneged on that promise to create no-take zones, areas where there is no commercial fishing, which is good for the fishing apart from anything else. Because when you've got reserves in which fish can get to maturity and reproduce, produce loads of young, they then spill out into surrounding waters where they can be caught. And we've seen with marine reserves all over the world how that has boosted the total take from fisheries. On land, I would like to see just really some pretty small tweaks which I think could stimulate a rewilding revolution. I would like to remove this ridiculous rule in the Common Agricultural Policy, which says that in order to claim that your major component of farm subsidy, the single farm payment, you have to keep the land clear of what it calls unwanted vegetation. You have to cut the trees down, you have to clear the scrub, you have to destroy habitats solely in order to claim your money. You don't have to farm it, you don't even have to keep sheep there. you just have to mow it every few years to prevent these habitats from developing. It's a perfectly designed system for maximum ecological destruction, and the only reason for it is our money. In fact, the only reason for any farming whatsoever in the uplands is our money. If you look at Wales, for instance, the average sheep farmer in the hills there takes £53,000 a year in subsidies. At the end of the year, ends up with £33,000. Keeping sheep in the hills costs £20,000 a year. Now, I don't want to see all hill farming come to an end, but I do want to give farmers a choice as to whether they really do want to lose £20,000 a year by chasing sheep over rain-sodden hills, or whether they prefer to take the money and lie on the beach. I would prefer them to take the money and lie on the beach, because then we could allow that land to rewild, and we could start bringing back some of our missing species, allowing trees to come back to our bare uplands, most of which are basically bowling greens with contours, stopping the perpetual cycle of drought and flood that we see in the lowlands, caused in large part by this scouring of the uplands where there's no vegetation to absorb the water and to release it gradually. What I would like to see is bringing back some of our missing species, some of the ones which can drive trophic cascades and these other fascinating ecosystem processes, things which, for me, are a source of great wonder and enthrallment, and take down the fences, block up the drainage ditches, and otherwise do nothing. We have this obsession, particularly in Britain, with management and stewardship. And we believe that we have to look after nature, otherwise something very bad will happen. As a friend of mine said, how did nature cope before we came along? It must have been in a pretty rotten state for the 3 billion years before human beings turned up to look after it. But you listen to a lot of British conservation groups, and this is exactly the line that they take. I mean, there's one reserve close to where I lived in mid-Wales, where in the management plan it says we have to spend an awful lot of time and money getting rid of undesirable invasive species. So I went to the group and said, what are these undesirable invasive species? They said, oh, that's trees. And I said, what, you mean like Sitka spruce or something? No, it's all these, these rowans and birches and sallow and things which just keep coming back, and we keep having to cut them down to keep it open. Well, why do you need to keep it open? Well, because that's how it was when we got it. And they're right on one level. When a site of special scientific interest is designated, it's designated to be kept in what's called favourable condition, which is a condition you found it in when it was designated. And so if the condition happens to be the aftermath of a nuclear winter, that's the condition in which you have to keep it. And my gosh, some of these reserves look like it. You are basically preserving what is there, however little it is, rather than picturing what could live there. And so my challenge is as much to the European Commission and its crazy farm subsidy rules as it is to conservation, as it is perhaps to ourselves about the possibility that we can open our minds to something really fascinating and enchanting which could be right on our doorsteps. And this, for me, is another of the wonderful things about rewilding, that it's a positive environmentalism. We environmentalists have been tremendously good at telling people what not to do. But what we've been missing is the positive vision, which tells people it's not just a question of making the world a little bit less worse than it would have been, but there's something wonderful that we can head towards. There's something magnificent that we can aim for. Rewilding, ladies and gentlemen, gives us the possibility that our silent spring could be replaced by a raucous summer. Thank you.